guys, I'm here today to do my last big wrap up video of all the books I've read since April. So I have quite a few non-fiction to talk about here, and I thought I'd also mention a couple of poetry collections I read during those months. I don't know how long this video is going to be because I feel like I'm not going to have a ton to say about a lot of these because it's been a while since I've read them, and unless I do my reviews sort of in a month it's quite hard, but I'm going to try my best. And I have quite strong feelings about a few of these, so maybe once I start talking about them I will remember what I want to say. So I'm going to talk about the poetry collections I read first. I borrowed both of these from the library. I borrowed quite a few poetry collections from the library recently, and I still have quite a few out from the library that I want to read. I decided to start giving poetry from the library a go because I really want to get more into poetry, but I don't know what works for me and what doesn't. And interestingly, I thought that what would work for me was reading poems that were a bit more straightforward, because I felt like I was really struggling with grasping what I was actually being told in a lot of poetry I've read previously. But the first one I want to talk about is Cherry Pie by Hollie McNish, and I felt the opposite. This is a really clear poetry collection, I felt. It is really easy to grasp what she's talking about in a lot of the poems. I feel like the big themes are class, she focuses a lot on what it's like to be working class, feminism and sexism, and also she talks a lot about family and relationships with family, like there's poems about her grandparents and things like that, and a lot about nostalgia and growing up. And all those themes are themes I really love, so if I was told any book dealt with those themes I'd want to read them, or that book. But yeah, I just felt like these poems were a bit flat for me, and I can't even remember one that really stood out, so this was just okay. So I guess I'm learning that maybe I don't necessarily just want poems I understand, because I want to understand them but also them still to have a real impact on me. So the one I did love and completely fulfilled that criteria was Homie by Danez. I absolutely fucking adored this poetry collection. It's hands down the best poetry collection I've ever read, not read many. So I watched Danez on a author event, I guess, read a lot of their poems aloud once I'd got it out from the library, and it really helped because I really got a sense of the rhythm that the poems would be read aloud in. And so then they read probably at least a third of the collection during that video, so there was a lot of content, and it was wonderful to come back to those poems and know how Danez would have read them, and also to take that rhythm into the other poems that Danez didn't read in the collection. It's absolutely brilliant. I highly recommend it. I'm not going to really go into it because I've seen loads of people who know way more about poetry than I do and review this one. I just think that if you are into poetry, if you're not into poetry and you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. It's phenomenal. I loved it. The next three books I read back in April, I think, for Springathon, and I actually didn't have a great success with Springathon. I DNF'd quite a few books. I finished 3 and I gave them 1 star, 2 stars and 3 stars respectively, so not great. So we'll talk about those first. The one I gave 1 star, I hated this book. Every part of it I hated. It's The Salt Path by Raynor Winn. This book has received rave reviews on BookTube from loads of people I admire, I take recommendations from. I think we have lots of crossover in taste, and I just don't get it. I buddy read this with Charlotte from Tired Mama Tries to Read and Shan from Storytime, and I think we all felt similar things about this book. I think I was the most angered by it, but none of us enjoyed it, and we all had lots of issues with it. If you don't know, although you probably do because this book has been raved about a lot over the past couple of years, Raynor Winn and her husband lived on a farm property, and they also had some sort of holiday rentals. She doesn't really go into it. They make a bad investment, also gives you no detail about that. They lose all their money and everything is repossessed, the home's taken away from them. At the same time, her husband, Moth, is diagnosed with a life-threatening illness which is debilitating for his health, and he's in a lot of pain all the time. And they go to meet with a social housing officer, and they decide that renting a home and Raynor having a job and them receiving disability allowance for Moth is not for them. They don't want to do that. Instead, they're going to declare themselves homeless, and they're going to go walk down through Cornwall and Devon and do this 630-mile walk and live in a tent. So obviously people make their own decisions. I don't think that's a sensible decision. your husband has a life-threatening condition, you have the opportunity to live in a home and like be safe and well, you know, as well as you can be, and they choose not to. So for the rest of the book, Raynor refers to them as homeless. And at the point when they are offered social housing, she makes some sort of comment about how degrading it would feel to drive past their old village and their old home in order to get to the social housing. And this whole book, she talks about how they're homeless and you're supposed to feel really sorry for them, and all I could come back to was, not really. You're super wealthy people. You never go into how wealthy you were, but it's very clear if you had enough money to make an investment that ruined you, you had a fair amount of money. And you made a bad investment, you lost your money, and then you didn't want to live in a council house because you think you're too good for it. That's what happened. And so instead you decided to sell this romantic notion of yourself to people that you're doing this coastal walk because you didn't want to actually say, we need government support, because you don't think you're that person. At the same time as this happens, their two children, one is working in London as some sort of, I think, PA, and one is at university. And if your parents were being made homeless and your father had a life-threatening condition in which he's told he may not live for very long, would you go, yeah, Mum and Dad, you know, that's fine, you guys just crack on, go sleep in a tent, and you know, just deal with it, and we're just gonna carry on with what we were doing, and like, you know, if you could feel guilty about not being able to send us as much money as you used to as well, that would be good for us. Also, incredibly unbelievable, like, if that was happening to your parents, why would you not band together as a family? Like, drop out of university for the year, just pause your studies, like, move back, get a home together, support them. So this notion of them being homeless is ludicrous, and she continually throughout the book compares herself to actual homeless people, who aren't sleeping in tents, by the way. They're sleeping on cardboard boxes outside shops, and, you know, hungry, like actually never have any money, they don't even have a bank account like these people, and yeah, like thinks they're on the same level. They're not. These people would not have been offered social housing, they would not have been offered benefits or any of those things. It's not the same. Other issues I have with this book are she's incredibly sizist, she talks about people's weight all the time, she talks about people's age all the time, she constantly says that people call them old, they're only in their 40s. She says that everybody they meet's really rude, I don't believe that either. So she just seems like a very unkind person and just constantly slagging everybody off. And also they're using this guidebook to do the walk. And they constantly talk about how the guidebook is really misleading because you're told how many days it should take to do the walk. And at the end of the walk, I was so annoyed with hearing her talk about how ridiculous the guidebook was that I did the maths of how many miles they walked a day, and they walked 4 miles a day, which isn't much at all, and that's completely fine. If you want to spend most of your time sleeping in your tent and looking at nice sights, and also your husband's ill, that's completely fine, but just acknowledge that. Don't say, oh, it's ludicrous that you could do the walk in this many days, because a lot of people can and do, hence why there's a guidebook that states it. And a final critique is that I saw lots of people saying in their reviews they thought the nature writing was really beautiful. There is barely any nature writing. There's even one bit where she says, like, she's complaining about their day and how rubbish it's been and how they've again just spent their last money on fudge. They steal because they decide to like eat fudge and wine gums rather than nutritious food, and obviously the fudge is expensive, so then they like steal sometimes, and sometimes they try and camp in nicer campsites that have showers, and they don't pay, and then they whinge because the people wanted to be paid. Well, yeah, they're a small family business. They'd like to be paid for you using their facilities. Sorry, I'm sure you wanted people to pay when they were staying in your, like, you know, converted barn before. So it's all very, like, high and mighty. And, yeah, also, there is barely any nature writing. There's a point where she even says, oh, you know, and after that, like, morning, we went and saw all these lovely things, and she lists in a paragraph 4 things they saw that morning. They all sounded lovely. Does not go into any detail. She doesn't want to talk about that. All she wants to do is complain. And even when she does spend a paragraph writing about nature, it's not particularly well written. It's completely standard. So I hated it. I have so many issues with it. I don't like either of them as people. I think they're incredibly privileged people trying to romanticise themselves as homeless in order to sell money, to sell a book and make a shit ton of money, and good for them, I guess, because now they're rich again. So, turns out I was still just as annoyed. Got it out of my system. The next book I read is Rain, 4 Walks in English Weather by Melissa Harrison. I previously read a couple of her novels and really enjoyed them. She writes beautifully about landscape and the natural world, and so I thought I'd give this a go. I love the rain. Rainy weather is my favourite type of weather. Even when I go out walking, I like it to be all rainy and drizzly. I just think it's a great atmosphere. And she basically takes you through rain in 4 different seasons in 4 different locations, and I really like the sound of it. I thought it would be really beautifully written. In actual fact, it's quite dry and academic, and she'll like reference like old dead white guy poets who wrote a poem about this type of landscape, and like just tell you some like information about how rain works as a system and how rivers work, and it's stuff that, like, you know, a lot of us would have learned in school, so it's nothing particularly new. And it's just, there's not much space at all for actual like nature writing, so I just found this quite dry and boring and disappointing. I gave it 2 stars because there was, you know, a couple of moments where she spent time actually describing the landscape and the atmosphere and nature, but not much. And then the last book for Springathon was Hidden Nature by Alys Fowler. I listened to this one on audio. This is about the author, this is a memoir about her buying an inflatable kayak, and she takes this kayak through Birmingham's canals. They have a really big canal system, and she goes down all these canals. And this also blends in with her story of the breakdown of her marriage to her husband, as she realises that she is queer and she finds a woman she loves, and she's trying to accept that she's leaving her husband, who's also incredibly ill, so she feels a lot of guilt there, and sort of starting this new chapter in her life. So there's elements of this book that I really enjoyed. I thought it was really interesting to have like a nature book focused on an urban landscape. I really enjoyed that. I also just liked her story about learning about the canal system, because she knew very little about it, and the history she tells you about the canal system and how they would have used it years ago to transport lots of goods, and also her learning about, you know, all the different types of kayaks and equipment she'd need. I thought that was really good. She also spends days where she goes out in the canals with friends, and I thought that was nice, like the camaraderie there and her telling you about these people. You feel that she really cares deeply for these people, and she gives a really warm description of each individual, which I enjoyed. However, I feel like this has been quite forgettable. Obviously I read it quite a few months ago and I don't remember loads about it, and I also felt like maybe it just didn't need to be quite so long. It does turn into, towards the second half in particular, her exploring more about her leaving her husband and meeting this woman than it does about the canals. And I don't know, I just felt like sometimes they felt like 2 different things happening in her life, and they didn't necessarily feel like she tried to put them in this book and for it to make sense together, and I don't know if they did. So yeah, I enjoyed this. I thought some bits were nicely written, but I thought a lot of it was also fairly forgettable, so there's that. And then next I have the graphic novel March, book 1. This is by John Lewis, Andrew Aydin and Nate Powell. This is the first book in, I think, a 3-part series that is about John Lewis's life. Sadly, John Lewis recently passed away. So this tells about his early years as like a young man, as he becomes like the politician he was. My knowledge of John Lewis was like 0. I just heard lots of American booktubers mention this and really rave about it, so I wanted to pick it up, just in general because I wanted to know more about the civil rights movement and the people involved. And this certainly gave me that. I'd give this like 3.5 stars. I really enjoyed it in terms of learning about how he came to be who he was and what it was like in his younger years, and the risks he had to take, and also the people he was involved in, or involved with, I should say. So I really enjoyed this, but I felt like I just wanted so much more. Like I felt like this was a great summary, and this is all it can be, right? Because it's short, because it's a graphic non-fiction book. But I feel like I'd just rather read this in like a chunky book form and get way more information. So do feel free to recommend me like any books about the civil rights movement that are like, you know, give more information, because I would love to learn more. So I've got 4 more books to talk about, and I'd really recommend all 4 of these because I thought all of them were great. So the first one I listened to on audio, and it's I Am Not Your Baby Mother by Candice Brathwaite. So this is only about 5 hours on audio, and I decided to go the audio route because she narrates herself, and if you follow her on Instagram, you know she's just really funny and warm, and so I thought it'd be great to like get her story directly from her. I know it is in written form, but it feels more personal when you hear the author read it themselves. This book is about the fact that Candice fell pregnant and she decided to start looking online, like into motherhood, as a lot of people do, and she realised that the experience of motherhood that's presented online, particularly on social media, is very white and middle class, and it didn't reflect her life experiences at all, or the life experiences of the other black women around her. So this book is non-chronological, and it talks about her life growing up, how she was incredibly close to her mother's parents, particularly her grandfather, and in a lot of ways they had a big part in raising her, because her mother had her when she was fairly young and then had other children like quite a few years later, so there was a fairly big age gap. So Candice always felt like she in a way raised her siblings herself, and so when she fell pregnant she was unsure how she was going to deal with having children of her own after her sort of rather turbulent upbringing. And she saw her dad separately because her parents were divorced, but she also talks a lot about her relationship with her father. She talks really beautifully about her relationship with her family, and she also talks really beautifully about her relationship with her partner. And each chapter focuses on a different topic to do with what it's like to be a black mother in the UK. So for example, there's a whole chapter on what it's like actually going through the process of dealing with hospitals, in particular with the NHS, when you are pregnant as a black woman. And each chapter will open with a statistic to do with what she's about to tell you. And this is why I do wish I had it in physical form, because obviously I can't like reference and tell you those statistics now, but there's shocking statistics she tells you about what it's like, how you're like, I think it's 4 times more likely to die in childbirth if you're a black woman. She tells you things about the education system and the criminal justice system, just like everything you can imagine she has looked into, and she gives you information, but it's mainly a memoir. So I really enjoyed this book. I think I'd have enjoyed it a little bit more had it had a bit more like delving into more statistics and information. This was incredibly personal, and I think this is really great for somebody who's like never thought about any of this, or maybe thought about racism but not thought about it in regard to like parenthood. But this is like a really approachable read, and I really enjoyed it because whilst I didn't necessarily learn a lot about like things to do with racism in the education system, the criminal justice system, I certainly did to do with motherhood, because it's not something I don't really think about what motherhood's like for anyone, because I'm not a mother and like don't plan to be, at least for a while. And also it was just really interesting to hear her personal experience. She's very funny, she's very warm. The only other thing I will say is like a slight criticism is there's a whole chapter on their decision to send their daughter to a private school, and she sort of has a debate with a woman and with some other woman about that, some other black woman, about whether that's the right thing to do, whether by putting our children in private schools we're sort of allowing public schools to not have to be better. And the author's argument is that she shouldn't have to have her daughter be this sacrifice for that. And whilst I completely see that as a personal choice, I struggle in any way to agree with private schools, because I do think in any regards, be that to do with gender, race, class, religion, by like paying for your child to be treated better or more equal, you're allowing the people who can't afford to pay to suffer. And I just don't think she delved into that enough, and there's a couple of moments like that where she just sort of doesn't really delve into it. She just says, this is the choice I made, and yeah, that's what we think. But I really enjoyed it and I'd highly recommend it. The next book I want to talk about, I also buddy read with Charlotte from Time Mama Tries to Read and Sian from Storytime, and that is the essay collection A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. This is one of my most anticipated releases of this year, and it was a really interesting essay collection to read. And I was just flicking through, you can see I have a lot of tabs, and there's so many amazing quotes in here, and it really made me want to like go back and revisit some of these essays. So Alicia Elliott was born to a white Catholic mother and a Mohawk father, and they spent a lot of their time moving around different parts of America when she was a child, and then eventually they moved to the Six Nations Reserve where her father was from, and her mother lived there as an illegal alien, so she wasn't registered, she wasn't allowed to live there. So A lot of the essays deal with the conflict of the relationship between her parents because of where they're both from. And what it was like for her father for a lot of years to feel like the outsider, and that complete flip, and what it felt like for her mother to feel like the outsider, and what it felt like for Alicia to always feel like the outsider, and always feel like she never truly belonged in either space. And when she'd go to the Six Nations reserves, her cousins would treat her and her siblings like they weren't like full blood. So there's an essay in here called Half Breed which deals with that, which is an excellent essay. Lots of the other essays deal with her mother's mental health. So her mother has bipolar disorder, and she'd have quite big mood swings, and a lot of the time her father would have her institutionalised, and she talks about what that was like. She also talks about a lot of the neglect they suffered as children, and they're incredibly poor, and she talks about how they were truly loved, but also a lot of the times hungry and not living in particularly sanitary conditions. There's lots of triggers in here. There's an essay in here about when she was sexually assaulted, and the way in which people talk to victims of sexual assault, and the way they expect people to like perform their pain, so to tell their stories in a way that people can like be curious about this awful thing, but also not know too much, because then like what do I say in return? Like, this is awkward for me. There's essays deal with like a vast array of topics: feminism, race, belief, sexuality, childhood trauma, and I really enjoyed this. I was hoping this would be like one of my favourite books of the year, and I ended up giving this 4 stars. I just felt like a few of the essays weren't as strong as the rest, and whenever that happens I always just wish the editor had said, do you know what, we're going to take those ones out, because this would be a stronger collection without those ones. And also I just felt like a lot of the essays were very thoughtful, and she came to points that I feel like I agree, and she didn't go any further than me agreeing, so I didn't feel particularly challenged by this collection in terms of my beliefs. And I think that's because I've read a few books that deal with this topic before and probably have gone further, and so whilst I really enjoyed hearing her perspective and getting her personal viewpoint on it, I didn't always feel like she went that one step further that I was hoping she would. I do think there's quite a lot to unpack here, which I found really interesting, in particular in regards to, like I said, her mother being white Catholic, and her father being Mohawk, and how she feels about that. And also there's quite a lot to discuss here in terms of how she feels about both her parents. And one of the essays which I've revisited a lot is the last one actually, and it's called Extraction Mentalities. I'm not going to, like, something is revealed in this essay which she's purposefully left to the end of the collection, which I found really interesting, and she asks you to like revisit like your previous thoughts based on the information she'd given you. And I thought that was really interesting. And then what she does is she structures the essay as a series of questions to you as the reader. So she gives examples of moments in her life, and she asks you what you think of those things, and sort of challenges you to view them a different way. And I thought it was absolutely phenomenal, and it gave me a lot to think about in terms of like all different types of abuse and gaslighting from parents. I thought it was really excellent. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this. I also think if you've like never really thought about any of these things, or read any collections like this, or just not read any essay collections, this is a really good place to start. It covers a broad array of topics, and I think because it's has lots of her personal stories within it, it's really like you can follow all these themes because you can connect them to her life, so I'd really recommend it. And then these last two I listened to on audio. So firstly we have Saigon, a misfits memoir of great books, punk rock and the fight to fit in by Phuc Tran. So Phuc moved to the US when he was about 5 in the 1970s after the fall of Saigon. And he lives in a really small rural town in, I don't want to get this wrong, I think it's in Pennsylvania, and it's about him trying to fit in. And the way he decides to try and fit in is to get really into punk rock. So there's a section in here where he says in order to not be viewed as an outsider because of his race, he decides to make himself an outsider for something else. So he dresses, you know, in extreme punk rock fashion, and he hangs around with all the other punk rockers at school. And so he becomes known for that rather than for his race. And a lot of this memoir is about what that meant to him and how as an adult he looks back and feels that, like, there's a lot of, it's really complex because actually what that means to him as an adult, that as a teenager he was ashamed of his race and he wanted to hide it, and how he doesn't feel that way now as an adult. And this is, you know, this is the first book that really made me think about what it must be like for the parents of an immigrant family, because his parents are obviously, you know, sort of, I don't know, in their 30s when they moved to the US, and so they really struggle to blend in. His father is awfully persecuted at work, and his mother really never really learns to speak English very well. And there's a section in this memoir where he talks about the fact that he could never really get close to his parents because their ability to understand English and his ability to understand Vietnamese were both so limited that instead they would just have this sort of broken conversations where they both speak the little bit of one another's language they could understand. And so much of knowing a person is being able to, like, talk about how you feel about things. And he said a lot of the elements of one another's language they learned were more like functional and not necessarily to do with emotion. And I found that really devastating. Each essay is titled after a book, and like, so the thing that stopped me from giving this 5 stars, because I absolutely loved it. It's so bizarre. So much of it is about him, his family being from Vietnam and how he feels he's treated because of that. So this book is obviously quite triggering. There's a few racial slurs in it, and there's moments where he's treated very unkindly by white children in this town. But at the same time as all that, it feels like very all-American. He really goes in on trying to be as American as he can. And so there's lots of, like, there's a moment where he sees his cousin and he refers to himself as Oriental, and they're like, what the fuck? Like, we're not Oriental. Like, why are you calling us that? Like, and he has to be schooled in, like, inappropriate ways to talk about himself and to talk about other Vietnamese people. So he really buys into the way white people talk about him, which is understandable. They're the only Vietnamese family in a, you know, really white town. But what I struggled with, so I was absolutely loving this book and I thought it was going to be like a 5-star read, but I just felt that so the book ends with his high school graduation, and I don't know, it just didn't really make sense to me as an ending point. He's talking a lot about college and how he feels like college is going to be the place where he's finally going to be able to, like, break free, and there's a really big discussion as to what type of college he should go to, whether he should go to, like, a really small liberal arts college where again it's going to be a lot of white people, or whether he should go to a college in a big city where there'll be way more diversity. And that's a really big topic, and then he just sort of leaves it with a high school graduation. And I also felt like, I thought that at the end there was going to be more of like a deep dive into how, like, all the books I think nearly all of them, all the books that are the titles of chapters are by dead white men. And he never really unpacked that. So I was like, well, when we get to the end of this book, I really hope you tell us that you do read books by people of other races, and other sexualities, and other genders, but he just doesn't, like, it's not unpacked at all. And I had a bit of an issue with that because I was like, I just want this to be a bit more intersectional. So I thought it was brilliant. I'd read anything he wrote in future, but it just wasn't, like, perfect for me. The last book I want to talk about is Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire by Akala. I absolutely loved this. I gave it 5 stars, one of the best books I've read so far this year. I listened to it on audio, so this is when I wasn't reading physical books and I really wanted to read this book, and I decided to go the audio route. Now, in a way I loved that because Akala narrates himself. He's absolutely brilliant at telling his own story, and there's lots of personal details about his life. This is sort of part memoir and part like deep dive into, like, the empire, exactly as the title says. And so I always like listening to books on audio narrated by the author when they have elements of memoir. However, this book also has a shit ton of like really important and fascinating information, and I would have preferred to read that in physical form. So I'm definitely going to buy this book in physical form. I'm definitely going to reread it because there is so much information that I just want to be able to like reference back to, and also like then tab and go do more research and find more books that deal with this. So if you don't know, Akala is a BAFTA award winning musician, but he's also a political commentator, and he, through his music, made lots of commentary on racism in the UK in particular, and then in more recent years he's become involved in lots of like activism to do with black youth and changing their mentality to how they're viewed, and the sort of aspirations, the things they can achieve. And this is just phenomenal. So he goes through his life, and in doing so he sort of focuses on themes, and so certain chapters will deal with certain things, like, you know, there's certain chapters on as a black man how common it is to be pulled over by the police. His father was black Jamaican, his mother's white Scottish, and there's a whole chapter on what it was like when he went to Jamaica, and because they view him as very light-skinned, how he was treated like his royalty there, whereas when he was back in the UK he was treated like awfully by lots of people, and how that was a really odd thing to deal with as a child and even now as an adult. And he talks about racism around the world, and whilst doing all this he focuses in particular on race and class in Britain and how those two things exist because of the empire building that Britain did. And he talks about how people will always try and separate race and class and have them as two different issues because it's convenient. Particularly for right-wing politicians, it's really convenient to separate people, put them into groups so they fight with one another, so that white working class people will not view themselves as the same as black working class people, and they will not see that they are treated, and their children are treated the same way within schools in terms of the neglect and the just like they're not worth bothering with. And so there's this purposeful grouping of people in order to stop us rising up as one, and this book is him trying to say, like, this country is fucking awful in terms of how racist and classist it is, and if we continue to perpetuate these things, we're allowing the British Empire to have won, to have been successful. And we can be told time and time again the British Empire no longer exists, but when the repercussions of it still exist and still play out in our day-to-day, then it's still winning, it's still there. I feel like I'm not doing this book any justice because there's just so much information, there's so much stuff in this, but I also felt like it wasn't dry at any point. It's not academic. I didn't find it a difficult read. It's incredibly readable. I just loved it. I thought everything about it was brilliant. Like, the one thing I found that he doesn't go into, but he does acknowledge this, he doesn't really go into gender. So a lot of his discussions are to do with black boys in the UK, but he says, like, I've heard him talk in interviews that he felt like he has a certain field of study and he feels like there's people way more educated and informed than him who can speak on racism as pertains to like gender, and that he doesn't feel like he can comment too much on what it's like to be a black woman because he isn't, and he hasn't so far done enough like research into that. So like for me that was just, I always love books to be as intersectional as possible. But I do think he went as far as he could like now with where he's at, and that possibly in the future he would like go further. So I absolutely loved it, I highly recommend it, and yeah, at least we ended on a high. So I feel like this turned out to be quite long. So yeah, but there was lots of really good books. There wasn't many like, well, there was a few like in between ones I guess, but there's some really amazing books and then some like not so great ones. So yeah, thanks for watching. Please let me know down below if you've read any of these books, and if so, what were your thoughts? And also feel free to recommend me any other books down below because, you know, always need more recommendations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!